Thanks for listening to the ArtTactic Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Green. It was great seeing so many of you in Miami for another year of Art Basel. Momentum in the art market seems to have really picked up over the past few months. It really started with Frieze London, continued through Basel Paris, and carried over into the November New York auctions. Heading into Miami, there was a lot of curiosity about how the fair would perform. Overall, it seemed like sales were solid. Some galleries had standout weeks, others were more measured, but the general sentiment was positive. What did feel different in Miami was the crowd. It seemed lighter than in recent years. I think there are a couple of reasons for that. First, with so many fairs packed into the calendar, collectors can't attend them all. So many collectors I know went to Basel Paris this year, and some felt it just wasn't essential to also travel to Miami just a month and a half later. And while sales were strong in Miami, that urgency and FOMO that really defined the art market over the last few years has calmed. And if collectors aren't certain they'll acquire multiple works at a fair, the pressure to attend just isn't there. We dig into all of this and more as we recap Basel Miami with Sarah Douglas, Editor-in-Chief of Art News and Art in America. Hope you enjoy our conversation. Thanks so much for listening. Sarah, thanks so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
Absolutely. Well, I know Miami is a very hectic time for you, running around to so many events and fairs and reporting. So appreciate you taking a little bit of time now that things have calmed down to help us recap this year's Art Basel Miami. So headed into the fair week, I thought you wrote a really interesting article about the floor plan for Art Basel Miami and how it actually shifted from last year. And the floor plan is something most people don't usually analyze closely. I mean, most people arrive to the fair, they receive a floor plan pamphlet, and they open it up and they figure out how they're going to navigate this massive convention center. So I really thought it was interesting that you actually looked at the floor plan and determined what changes occurred from the previous year. What stood out to you as the biggest changes? And what did those shifts signal, perhaps, about expectations for this year's Art Basel Miami?
Yeah, well, when I was looking at it, one thing stood out to me, and they'd moved some sectors around. They had moved, I think I said this in the piece, they moved one of the specialized sectors, I think it was positions, but it might have been Nova, into an area where there normally, I think, would have been regular old main sector booths. In any event, if you just from glancing at the floor plan, you could see that the 010, which was the digital portion of it, was taking up, quite a bit of square footage. So you could see how things had moved around almost like in relation to that. And, so never quite trusting my own judgment on these things, since I'm not an art fair producer. I called someone who will remain unnamed, but who over the years has worked at many, many art fairs and looked at logistics and floor plans and all fun things like that. And they sort of confirmed something that I'd been sort of thinking about, which is that there seemed to be, in general, just less space for the main sector. And I think another thing that I pointed out, I mean, there were also larger booths, but one thing I pointed out is you had actually a few more galleries sharing booths than in the past. So, that's always something that I'm looking at, when they say on a list, we have X number of exhibitors, right? But how many booths do you have, So it's like, you always have to look beyond the numbers. And, you do run the risk of getting a little bit into the weeds when you do this. I mean, I literally was just reading a report, and I'll get into this hopefully later in our conversation, where someone who was reporting on the fair said, well, I walked in and it was the same labyrinth of booths from 20 years ago. And I said, I thought to myself, like, I don't know, there's this Henry James quote that's like, be someone on whom nothing is lost. Um, and the thing is, there was a huge change in the map in 2009. So this thing has changed a lot. You got a brand new convention center. So these fairs, it does, because it is still a labyrinth of booths, it has a way of fooling us into thinking it's always the same, but it's not.
Yeah, definitely. And one of the big stories of the week, I think, actually unfolded before the fair even opened, which you noted in your coverage of the fair that you wrote with your colleagues at Art News. You mentioned, I think, in the first paragraph, the word momentum. And it did feel like there really was momentum in the art market headed into Miami, which is a little bit different than some of the feelings permeating through the art market earlier in the year. To give us some of that context heading into this week, where do you think that momentum originated from, and how did it shape the mood and even expectations going into this year's Basel Miami?
It's funny, I just had this conversation a few days ago. Art News is doing a series of talks at Casa Cipriani, and we did a talk with great art advisor Candace Worth, who works sort of on the contemporary, more, younger contemporary end of things. And so we had a conversation about exactly this question, the shift in the mood, when did it happen? And I think there's a general agreement that it was in October. Starting with London, going into Paris. I can't speak to London directly because I wasn't there. However, I did go to Art Basel in Paris, and there, compared to what you were hearing in September, which was this narrative of galleries closing and a lot of sort of doom and gloom. Paris certainly seemed like much brighter and more optimistic. Now, of course, I'm skeptical of everything, so I'm never sure whether to trust that. But, people were selling things, but listen, they always tell us they sell things at art fairs. But there was a kind of mood in Paris that was upbeat. People were excited. They wanted to go to museum exhibitions. They wanted to, see the best art at these booths. They wanted to talk to each other. But here's the thing is you're in the most beautiful city in the world
Yeah.
with the best museums in the world, like no offense, New York or London, and so is that, the art market getting better? Or is that like the Paris effect? I don't know. Anyways, then you went into the auctions, and you had you happen to have all this great quality material coming up for sale, and the auctions were really solid. I mean, $2.2 billion. Like, no one can deny that that's a large figure, and they did, as better than expected. So I guess the real question in my mind when you talk about something like Miami is, again, with Miami, we see these really solid, sales happening on the high end. And you see, some on the low end too. But, I number one, do these huge prices, does a Klimt selling for $250 million translate to a better mood for someone selling paintings for $20,000? I don't know. I have my doubts about that. And number two, um, that I mean, that disconnect, I guess what I was struck by this whole fall was this kind of meta narrative of, oh, you journalists keep writing stories about how everything's bad. You're making things bad. I mean, some people would tell this right to my face, even though we weren't maybe as harsh on the art market as some of our competitors, and nothing against our competitors,
Yeah.
And it really made me wonder, like, how solid can a good market be if we lowly journalists can take it down with a stroke of the pen? I mean, I don't mean to be, but it's true, right? So, anyways, it was this question of perception. I realize I'm being a bit discursive, but that's sort of my discursive thoughts on that.
Yeah, I have a few thoughts about some of the things you said. I also heard complaints from a lot of galleries about the negative coverage of the art market from the press, really throughout the year, but especially in that summer period when not much is happening in the art world. And I think for galleries that don't represent a lot of artists with active secondary markets or whose works aren't traded regularly at auction, I do think it can be harder to gauge where those markets stand at any point. Maybe that segment of the market is more vulnerable to kind of anecdotal assessments of sentiment. About the momentum and the question I asked about that, it's interesting. I was in London and Paris, or Frieze London and Basel Paris, and what I found fascinating was the energy in both cities felt genuinely strong. People there were not talking about the softening art market. There was real enthusiasm, there was robust demand, and really positive reactions in London to the gallery shows during Frieze, and sales seemed to reflect that. And that energy, I think, continued into Paris during Art Basel. And interestingly, when I shared kind of some of my feedback with some of my clients and other collectors in the US who weren't traveling to London and Paris, they were almost somewhat skeptical. It was almost hard for them to believe that the energy seemed to have shifted in the art market and was positive. I think nowadays we think about the art market as a global art market, but it felt almost regional in that moment where if you weren't there experiencing those fairs and the gallery scenes there, you really had no idea that the energy had shifted. A really fascinating concept. And then, of course, a month later, the November New York auctions made that momentum very transparent to everyone, and I think confirmed that potentially there was a rebound that was underway.
I mean, it just what you're saying makes me think, well, hey, maybe that's why, maybe that's part of the good thing about these fairs is they get everyone together. You see a bunch of art. Well, how can you not be kind of excited, and how can that not inject? Because again, it's real. The perception thing is real because somewhere down the line, there's a collector who says, hey, you know what? I see that this Klimt sold for $250 million. They're not saying this consciously. This is like deep in their,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
like, lizard brain. And they're like, wow, this thing is sexy and cool. And I'm going to go in and I'm going to buy something. They're like, that's real. It's real. So I guess all we can say at the end of the day is the mood has improved. The mood has improved. And it's nice. You go out of for these dealers and go out of the year with something of a nice, upbeat mood.
Yeah. And so you touched on this a little bit already, but heading into the week, I think there was a lot of curiosity about how the fair would actually perform from a sales perspective. We touched on the momentum heading into the week, but it felt genuinely uncertain if that would continue, and it seemed like the fair could have gone in a few different directions. From all of your reporting and speaking with galleries and visitors, what is your sense of how sales were at Basel Miami this year?
Well, I mean, I want to look, you've seen the sales figures, that I've seen. I mean, the top sale was the $18 million Muhammad Ali, which if you went to Miami, I mean, Levy Gorvy, Diane had set up a shrine to this thing. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but the wall was painted red or something, and it was like very dramatic. And that, was the top recorded sale. I'm just now glancing at my list here, but just off the top of my head, David Werner, sold quite a few things in the north of $1 million territory. Just glancing at this, you had, $5.5 million Richter, and Alice Neal for 3.3 million, two Albers paintings, 2.5 and 2.2, Dana Schutz for 1.2 million, which went to a museum, an American museum, though they didn't disclose which one. And actually, I believe them on that because it's tricky with these acquisition boards and it goes through a whole process. But Ruth Asawa for 1.2 million, we're talking really high end now, but those things are important again for perception of whether or not this thing was quote unquote successful. Hauser and Wirth, George Condo for 4 million, Louise Bourgeois 3.2, another one for 2.5. So I could go on, but we get these reports of sales. And then at the end of the fair itself will send out to journalists, and this is also, you can find this online, a press release that has all the reported sales in it, right? In other words, the sales that the galleries report to the fair. And just last night, I was talking with a different fair director, not Art Basel, and I was saying, when you actually look at the number of galleries that report their sales to the fair, and then you compare that to the list of galleries in the fair, it is a tiny fraction.
Yeah.
Okay. Tiny fraction. I sometimes think we should tell our readers that it's a tiny fraction. And I said, well, of course, in my skeptical mode, right? I start thinking, are people not reporting because they didn't sell? Okay. And she said, you know what? Some people just don't want to report. They just don't want to report, what they sold. And, that's up to them. That's at their discretion, whatever. But I guess I'm just saying, and every journalist says this to you on your show, there is a point at which we don't know. We see these reported sales and it looks like a successful fair. But people have written about, some of these sales have been, months in negotiations, and the gallery will decide to sort of bring that to the fair, and that will be the culmination, a signing on the dotted line of a process that's been going on. So when we say at the fair, that can also mean, well, it kind of pre-sold, but it didn't. So these things are tricky. But again, the perception, and that's important. I actually want to say something else about art fairs, which is that I was talking with someone, again, someone who works for another fair. This person said, a lot of you journalists seem to think we're the big bad, we're the big bad enemy. And I said, I don't think that at all. I'm trying to take a nuanced view here. And I think it's a whole ecosystem. We're just trying to figure out, how it's working, right? And if it's working, et cetera. And this person said, there's a lot of galleries, like you guys tell the story of someone did an art fair. They didn't sell anything, and then they closed, which we know there's a gallery that literally went out with that narrative. But do you ever tell the story of a gallery that wouldn't be able to function if not for the art fairs? And they went to an art fair and they did it, and they were able to keep doing business because they did an art fair. And I said, well, you know what? Maybe we should be doing more of those stories. I don't know. So.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And something we haven't touched on yet in our conversation, but I wanted to ask you about, is the impact of Basel Paris on the broader fair landscape. Since the launch of Basel Paris, I've noticed a recurring question while I've attended Basel, Switzerland, which is the Paris fair cannibalizing, and will it cannibalize the Swiss edition, where some Americans are choosing Paris over Basel because it's a more appealing destination. And as a result, Art Basel in Switzerland is becoming more European-centric than it was in the past. Interestingly, this year in Miami, it felt to me, and I spoke to some galleries and others there in attendance, that while sales in Miami were solid, the attendance in Miami was lighter than in the last several years. It just didn't feel as crowded on the ground at the fair or at the events around town as it has in recent years. And I know some Americans who went to Basel Paris and then they decided to skip Basel Miami this year. I'm not saying everyone's doing that, but I'm curious how you see this shifting fair landscape. Did you hear from people who think maybe Paris is actually impacting Miami as well, not just Basel, Switzerland? And really, it's the success of Basel Paris that might be influencing both the Swiss fair and the Miami edition.
Well, I have a number of different sort of reactions to that. But let me say the first one that comes into my head is one of these mega galleries. I was talking to the owner, and I was saying, why does it feel, Paris felt so buzzy and crowded, and even in the so-called avant-premiere, super VIP, VVIP thing, it still felt crowded. And that was supposedly like the top slice. And why does it feel like way less attended here? And he kind of made the most obvious point. He was like, well, this is you just got a bigger space here. In Paris is just not a huge space, and so you're going to have the compression, and it's going to make it seem more crowded. It's like it's like the most obvious thing that you kind of forget about. But my impression when I arrived at Miami for that first preview day was there was kind of a long line, and I think I heard other people got kind of stuck in a line, and then once you get in, you're like, wow, why was the line so long? There's like nobody here. So I felt a little bit of that too, and I don't mean nobody. I mean there were people there. What I didn't see is that kind of frenzy, but of course we haven't seen that for a while. But I will say this, I saw very few Europeans. And I even, again, this is like me going to the art fair organizer, like saying, am I seeing what I think I'm seeing on this fair map? I went to a European dealer and I said, like, are you seeing any Europeans? And he said, no, you're right. There's not a lot of Europeans here. So, and Jason Farago made the same observation in his piece for the Times, where he does the sort of trifecta of Basel fairs, right? He went to Hong Kong, Basel in Switzerland, and Paris, and Miami. Wait, that's four. Anyways, and he sort of says that they are each becoming more regional. Vis-a-vis Paris versus Basel, there were people who were saying to me when Paris started, something to the effect of, how could Basel be so stupid? They're cannibalizing their own business.
Right, I
That
remember.
that was like a response from some people right from the get-go. All I could think of was, wow, this is amazing to have an art fair in Paris. It's like the best thing ever. Why isn't someone, of course there was FIAC, but it didn't quite have the same, stature as Basel. I was kind of like, why didn't they do this years ago? This is a great city. Um, I I've actually heard, and by the way, people said there weren't a lot of Americans in Basel this year. I remember this because I'd be like, who was there? They named like two people. And I was like, is that, if that's all you can remember. Anyways, but I guess I've also heard the opposite. I've also heard people saying, you know what? As Paris gets more and more of an audience, there will be people who still really value that experience of being in Basel and being able to really focus on the fair, and not have all the distractions of, the food, the many museums, the beauty of the city. Again, nothing against Basel. I happen to like it there, but and so I think there'll be this ping pong effect. Maybe people will do, Paris and then Basel the next year. I actually think it will all somehow work out. And I think the observation that they get a little more regional is probably right. I mean, one thing that people have complained about with these fairs since day one, or AKA 2005, right? Let's just say 2005, is that you have crappy hotels priced at $1,000 a night, right? So that's because you can. So maybe if there's more of them, that'll be less of a problem. I don't know. I'm trying to see the bright side in all of this.
Yeah. And when I think about each edition of Basel, they take place in such different cities that the visitor experience, it doesn't feel repetitive. Miami, Paris, Hong Kong, Basel, Switzerland. I mean, if someone goes to Basel, Switzerland in June, they aren't going to say, I don't want to go to Paris in October because the two cities
Yes.
are so alike.
Yes.
That's just not going to happen.
Yes, exactly.
So, my final question for you, with Miami being really the last major moment and test of the year, where do you think the art market stands as we head into 2026?
I think people are generally feeling upbeat. I mean, I think that's what anyone would tell you. I want to add like just a footnote to Miami that I think is really important. I think that 0-10 section freaked a lot of people out. I think like that shouldn't be disregarded when thinking about this Art Basel Miami, because if you read through some of these longer pieces that are, here was my experience in Miami, whatever, I'm not going to name names or name writers, you'll see a lot of nostalgia Okay, nostalgia for the old days of Art Basel Miami. And I just feel like nostalgia is generally like a sign of a culture at an inflection point, right? Like you see that throughout history. And I think that you can say 010's the worst, crap I've ever seen. Which, I might well say that if, I had a couple of glasses of wine or whatever. But we have to contend with that. And I think that really threw kind of a wrench into the works because when you went into that section, it was a different crowd. It was just a different crowd. And I think like you can also read throughout the coverage of Basel, like disdain for that section. They don't want it to be called a sector. I actually don't know what they want to call it. But I think that's something meaning the art world, we're being forced to contend with. And I think it has resulted in this like wave of nostalgia that's about everything from, the wacky art projects people used to do in their booths to, oh my God, the Raleigh and the Delano are being torn down. Like people are finding like proxies for this feeling of unease. And that to me is the most interesting thing as an observer at this year's fair. But if you're just asking me about the art market, I think people are breathing a sigh of relief. You know what I think was the key quote from this past Basel was David Zwirner. He said to me, I can't complain.
Mm.
And like that is, I think that's what people should be going out of the year with. You know what? You can't complain. It's, this is a good place to be going into January. Art Basel did its job.
Yeah, and the 010 section, we haven't touched on it yet. For listeners who didn't attend Basel Miami, it was positioned near the Meridian section, technically within the main fair, but a little bit off to the side. It was kind of an area where you could go over there and really fully immerse yourself in it if you chose to, but you could also just catch it out of the corner of your eye when you were navigating the main fair and decide not to engage and go into it. It's not the type of digital art that I focus on in my advisory or on the podcast, but the convention center is so vast that when I reached that part of the fair, I thought I might as well step in and take a look because I might not pass this area again. And of course, Beeple's artwork was in that section. And whether you like it or not, it was the most talked about work at the fair this year. So I felt like I had no excuse to go check it out, even briefly, to take it all in. You mentioned that the section freaked some people out or it bothered them. Can you elaborate on that? Is there concern that digital art could expand and maybe take up more real estate within the fair, or what's the underlying issue there?
I mean, it was definitely under the tent, okay? It wasn't like in the hallways where you don't have to pay to get inside. Like
Right, right.
you would have to pay an attendance fee or have a VIP card, whatever, it depends on where you're going to see that stuff. So I do think there was this kind of forget barbarians. Barbarians are just inside the gate kind of feeling. And I mean, literally on Instagram, one art advisor who I think has, really good taste. I mean, if you told me to buy something, I'd buy it, kind of thing. He had an image of him like standing in front of like the Beeple thing, like giving it the middle finger. So I also think there was some hate viewing.
Yeah.
You know how like there's shows you hate watch or like people you hate follow on social media? There was some like hate viewing of 010. And just again, as an observer, which, in my profession, we try to stand back from everything, insofar as it's possible. Like that's where I think like the real kind of discomfort was. And by the way, just one last thing is like, I went in there and I saw some folks that I saw last year at the Christie's Art Tech Conference, and I think this is important, like kind of as a metaphor, which last year it was, and I think they did it again this year, but I'm not sure. It was across the causeway. Okay. It was on the other side. It was in Miami. It wasn't on the beach. And so it was at a remove, but this year, those folks, they were inside and they had their, place and their stuff in there. And so I think it was kind of like this. It was a thing. I think it's, as I say, it's something we all have to contend with.
Yeah, we'll definitely be monitoring that, as I'm sure you will and many others, in terms of how Art Basel continues to develop that platform. I heard that they'll have it at Art Basel Hong Kong, and we'll just have to see how all of that plays out. Sarah, thanks so much again for coming onto the podcast and helping us recap Art Basel Miami 2025. We really appreciate your valuable perspective. And if our listeners don't already, they should definitely check out all of your coverage in art news and in Art in America. And if you want to follow you on social media, where can we find you there?
Me on social media, my social media is pretty silly, but I am Sarah L. Douglas on Instagram.
Thanks so much again, Sarah. Speak to you soon.
Thank you.